Thank you all very much for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction, though now I'm worried, like, this guy's really smart. It's like, well, let's just see how smart this guy really is. So only the bar were set just a little bit lower, that would be fine. I was having a conversation not too long ago with a friend of mine, and I have at dinner last night, we all got to have dinner over at the Market Street Grill. We were talking about just a wide variety of things. If you ever listen to my podcast, The Council of Trent is the name of my podcast, Counsel. So that's available at trenthornpodcast.com. You know that on Fridays, I do shows where I talk about whatever I want. It's kind of a free-for-all Friday. So I have like kind of a wide, eclectic set of interests, things I just enjoy reading and learning about. So for example, last night we were able to spend, gosh, it felt like an hour just talking about Sylvester Stallone movies. Who here likes Sylvester Stallone movies? Anybody? I mean, of course you've got your classics, you have Rocky and Rambo, but you also have other things that are underappreciated, like disaster adventure movies like Cliffhanger, Daylight is another example, and of course, the cult classic, the Sylvester Stallone arm wrestling movie. If anyone has seen it, Over the Top. Who's seen Over the Top? Come on, okay. Very good, and that movie certainly is over the top. So, wide eclectic interest. Another one, I enjoy history, including histories of famous disasters. And I had a friend of mine, we were having this conversation, and we were talking about the RMS Titanic. And she is really obsessed with the Titanic. Like, she goes, like, if she hears a museum has an exhibit of new artifacts, she has to go and see it. And so I was reading about that, and then I was reading about kind of these conspiracy theories related to the Titanic, that White Star Lines intentionally sank the Titanic or switched it with a sister ship for insurance money. And I just wanted to get her goat. And I said, you know, Teresa, I don't think the Titanic really sank. I think the story was all made up. I mean, can you explain the fact that in the newspaper accounts afterwards, the eyewitnesses give two separate accounts? They say that some people say the ship went down whole, other people say it broke in half. How do you explain that? She says, I have a perfect explanation, okay? When the ship's lights went out, it's completely dark, cloudy, moonless night, and because of that, some people did not hear when the ship broke apart. And she's going through this lengthy explanation. I said, Teresa, I'm just pulling your chain a little bit. So we were talking more and more about this, and well, this is actually a few years ago, because we were talking about it shortly after, 100 years after the Titanic sank. Another ship foundered off the Mediterranean coast. You may have heard of it, the Costa Concordia. Anyone remember the foundering of the Costa Concordia? And they're 100 years apart. They reveal something very interesting, though, about human nature and about where we've come as a society in 100 years. For example, you go back to the Titanic, you were more likely, if you were part of steerage, the third class, if you were a woman or child in third class, you were more likely to survive the disaster than if you were a man in first class. Because the men voluntarily chose to stay on the ship so that women and children could be able to be evacuated and get to safety first. And then, of course, Captain Edward Smith stayed with the ship until it went down, and as the old maritime adage goes, the captain went down with the ship. That was the Titanic. 100 years later, Costa Concordia, a very different story. Here what happens is you have one, Mr. Captain Scatino of the Costa Concordia, in an attempt to impress those on shore at a nearby island and his mistress, who was also on board the ship, did a sail-by too close to a nearby island, went off the charted path, and struck an underwater reef. Thankfully, though, the ship managed to drift back into shallow waters. But it was complete chaos on board, and when it realized the ship really was sinking, you had male crew members who were taking life jackets and taking things out of people's hands, fleeing the ship for themselves. Scatino was one of the first people actually off the ship when he realized that it was sailing. And if you know Italian, it's probably pretty funny, but even if you don't, it's hilarious. You have to listen to the transcripts between the Italian Coast Guard and Captain Scatino. And they're telling him, Scatino, how many people are on board? You know, what's the situation there? He says, well, I'm not on board anymore. I'm coordinating from shore. They say, Scatino, you know, bleep, 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 bleep. You could tell, like, oh, these are Italian curse words if I've ever heard one. How angry they're getting at him, that the captain needs to be on the ship helping people. And tragically, several dozen people did lose their lives on the Costa Concordia. But seeing just that difference of what is expected for men. And that's hard for us as men of faith to live in the world today because people have such low expectations for us. In fact, I was talking to someone outside here at the table. We were talking a little bit about this very subject, and she brought up this point about how, if a man changes a diaper in a restaurant, that, oh, he's being a great dad, but if a woman is doing it, like, why are you doing that out here in public? Why aren't you in the bathroom? That if a man does anything where he's helping, because we have such low expectations. I'll give you an example. I was at Disneyland with my wife and her sister. So we got a ton of kids. We got 2 strollers, okay? And I'm pushing both strollers like this. And I see people looking, and I heard somebody say, give that dad a medal. A medal? But I'm telling you, if my wife had been there pushing both strollers, people would have said, like, why do you bring so many kids here, Maybe this has happened to you as men. I don't know if any of you who are married has happened to you. But people always end up giving my wife a hard time when I'm not there. Now, when I'm there, nobody says an underhanded comment or says anything. But then when I find out that somebody has mistreated her or done something wrong, I have to go and set things right. I remember my wife told me that someone at Sprouts, at the grocery store, one of the checkout ladies, was just really, really mean to her and rude about how she was handling the kids, and she's trying to get through. She's got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old climbing on her, just trying to get through. And this lady just said just really mean, vicious things to her. And so I heard that, and I flame up, as some of us are prone to do. I'm like, okay. So then I just hopped in the car. I said, who did this? What was her name? You get this thing like, I need to go and fix this. And of course, our wives always say, I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to listen. You're not helping. Listening isn't going to solve anything. Action will solve something, right? And so I hop in, and so I say, well, what is she? I don't know. She was a middle-aged woman. She sounded like she was from Boston or something. I don't know. Trent, don't do anything. I'll be right back. And I go, and I drive in my car down to the Sprouts, and I walk in, and I'm getting ready. I want to go up to the intercom. I want to go on the microphone and say, all checkout clerks, I need you to repeat after me. I parked my car by the harbor. Ready? Each of you say it. Parked car by harbor. There she is. No, there's the Bostonian who was mean to my wife, but I realized, nope, that would be me being a crazy person. I'm going to dial it down just a little bit, and I'm going to pray for this woman. I'm going to go back home and be with my wife. But I had this urge to want to do something. And I think that's the classic fight we have at home, especially with spouses and others as men, that when something is wrong, we want to do something. We want to be able to fight. We want to be able to take this on. And unfortunately, we live in a society today where the masculine desire to want to fight, to want to set things right, is really vilified. That the American Psychological Association, a group supposedly collection of experts on psychiatry and psychology, which they aren't, released a report recently saying that traditional masculinity is dangerous. Now, they didn't take a very narrow set of behaviors, like obviously things like, abusing drugs, being aggressive or violent towards your family members. Obviously, those things are wrong. That's bad. But they even said being stoic, adventuresome, that traditional masculinity is dangerous for men. And so you hear a lot of these days, you hear things like, have you ever heard people talk about toxic masculinity? You guys ever hear that phrase? I don't think anyone would. Could you imagine, like we see on mainstream media, people will talk about the dangers of quote unquote toxic masculinity, which when you ask someone to define it, sounds a lot like traditional masculine virtues, like courage, stoicism, fighting for what's right. You would never hear anyone talk about toxic femininity. Or imagine if a news anchor said, we need to do something about toxic homosexuality. That the news anchor tried to, a commenter tried to say that, well, homosexuality is fine, but not toxic homosexuality. He would never hear the end of it. But masculinity is a problem, that it's seen as something dangerous. And the idea to toxic masculinity or traditional masculinity is to say, well, men, and I see this with my 4-year-old and 2-year-old sons, that people look at masculinity, look at men and boys, and they just see defective women and girls. That even when little boys go to school, little boys have a problem because they won't just sit still for 40 minutes. They have to run outside and get their energy off. That men want to be able to compete with one another. But competition, and that's what the APA said, that competition is a bad thing. No, I'm sorry. Competition is why I have a cell phone that's not the size of a brick. Okay? Competition is a good thing. Masculinity is a good thing, and we should be able to fight for what we believe in, to fight for what we value, to fight for our families, to fight for our country, and to fight for our faith. But how do we do that today? It's not like there's barbarian hordes at the gate like there were at Rome 1,500 years ago. But I believe what we do have as men, we have an opportunity to fight for our faith. And I've been blessed with an opportunity to be able to do that through Catholic Answers. And that's to stand up for our faith and engage those who disagree with it, to stand up for the truth and to fight for the truth, but to do so with words, to take heed of what St. Peter said in 1 Peter 3:15, to always be ready to give a reason for the hope within, but to do so with gentleness and with reverence. So we can fight, but we're not swinging fists, we're not yelling words, but we can do so in a powerful and persuasive way so we can stand up for our faith. And that's what I try to do every week or every other week on Catholic Answers Live. If you heard in my bio, I do these shows like, why are you, when I was brought into Catholic Answers Live 6 years ago, they said, "Do you want to do radio?" I said, "Sure." They said, "Yeah, well, we do shows, people call in, they ask questions about being Catholic." Now, I used to be on university campuses where I would go and set up pro-life exhibits with pictures of unborn children before and after abortion. So people would get a tad bit upset. And people would come to me, I'm really upset. I'm like, well, I'd be upset too if I saw that this was happening to unborn children. But why are you mad at me? I once said to someone who was really trying to get under my skin, I said, "Why are you so mad at me? I'm not the one who killed these children." And that really sent it a little bit higher than it needed to be. Well, sometimes it needs to be said. In any conversation you have with someone, you always have to make a determination. Some people need velvet glove, other people need iron fist. So you always have to make a determination of when that's necessary for that person in that conversation. But no matter what we do, we should still understand that the person that I'm talking to who disagrees with me, they are not an enemy. It's not me versus them. I look at someone on the radio, they said, "You want to do these call-in shows?" They said, "Yeah, but I tell you what, I only want to do them if people who are not Catholic are allowed to call me. Don't let the Catholics call. I love my Catholic brothers and sisters. But it's really, really fun when I can say, if you're an atheist, if you're pro-choice, if you believe in so-called same-sex marriage, if you're Protestant, if you're not religious, I want you to call and I want you to tell me why you think that way. And then we can have a conversation about it." And that this person who sometimes can be very, very hostile to me, sometimes they aren't, but a lot of times they can be very hostile, I don't see them as an enemy. I'm not out to destroy them. I'm out to help them be rescued from the error, the lie that has ensnared them. My enemy is the evil one, the Prince of Darkness, who ensnares people with these lies and deceives people. And I ask for the grace of the Holy Spirit to be able to put an idea in their mind to get them to think about this so that they can walk away from these lies and come closer to the truth. And that's a method of defending our faith I love teaching other people, because we have a lot of great resources that have come to us as Catholic men, especially in the past 20 years. I mean, you've got wonderful things from the St. Paul Biblical Center, Franciscan University, Focus, Augustine Institute, Formed. You go outside at the vendors here at this conference today. You'll have so many great resources to learn about our faith. We have all the answers are out there. But then we go and we talk to our coworkers. We talk to our relatives, our nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, grandchildren, grown children, brothers, sisters, parents. And we get in these discussions, these disagreements, and sometimes it seems like those answers, they just don't come to us. It's like the tank is empty. Like, we've read these books, we've gone to these talks, we go to this conference, we hear all these great speakers are motivated, we hear great theology, we watch talks online, and then we just don't have it. And we don't know what to say in these conversations, and we fall into two different traps. One trap is, I want to get really assertive and say, this is the truth, and you need to hear it, and kind of turn up the volume so that people will hear me. Even if I don't have the answers, they'll hear the volume. Or we turn down the volume. We become these Mr. Nice Guys. I don't want to have toxic masculinity. So live and let live. That's what you believe. It's your truth, my truth. I just want to get along with everybody. We want to be what our culture wants from us, which is Mr. Nice Guy. But that's not what God wants from us. In Ephesians 4:15, St. Paul says we should speak the truth, but do so in love. But what do? We've been trained to think if someone attacks our faith, makes an argument against us, says they're not Catholic, or they disagree with abortion or homosexuality or whatever it may be, that we've got to give this list of answers. I remember when I got hired at Catholic Answers back in 2012. These were people who were formative in my own conversion to the Catholic faith. And so I go here, and I step into the Catholic Answers headquarters in San Diego, California, and I'm meeting these people for the first time. People like, Tim Staples. He's got the whole Bible and catechism memorized, it seems like. And Jimmy Akin, who I'm pretty sure is a robot the church sent from the future to try to fix things, because he has an inhuman amount of knowledge. And then I walk in there, and it's like, when I walked in there, it felt like, anyone ever see the old Super Friends cartoon back from the 1970s? It's got the guy from Caddyshack as the announcer. Meanwhile, back at the Hall of Justice. I feel like there's Batman, there's Superman, and here walks in Robin, the boy wonder, sans the short shorts, thankfully. And so I'm like, well, I'm not wired like some of these people. Maybe you're not wired this way. I'm not wired to know, the entire Bible or catechism, every single thing memorized. A lot of times, one of the things that's hard in my books, I always get emails about this. When I try to cite scripture or I write things down, I have this awful habit of transposing numbers or switching letters and switching numbers. It's like dyslexia, but not exactly like that. So I'm always praying to Dog that he will do something about that. So anyone? So sometimes I can't cite everything, but if there's one thing I want you to take away from the method I want to teach you, it's this. You don't need to have all of the right answers. When you go out and you want to stand up for our Catholic faith, and you want to make a defense for the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Catholic faith, you do not need to have all of the right answers. You just need to have the right questions. Don't need the right answers. You just need the right questions. Because there's two parts to defending our faith. First, there's mounting a positive case. Here's the reasons you should be Catholic. Here's the reasons this disputed moral teaching, which is usually a pelvic issue, as it's euphemistically called. Here's why it's true. There's mounting our case, putting together the answers, but a lot of people jump to that and jump over another important step. Here's my case, but before I do that, here's some problems with what you believe. Here's something about what you believe that doesn't entirely make sense, and I think is problematic. I'll give you an example. I was once giving a pro-life talk at a Catholic high school. I'm giving a large audience, but I noticed in the back there was a girl who was not happy with my presentation, not one bit. I'll call her Kylie. And she's just sitting there, just giving me the evil eye, making sure that I can see her, that she's not happy. And so I'm done with the talk. I say, does anyone have any questions? Like instantly, her arm shoots up. All right, go ahead. And she gets up, and she asks a question that's really more of a statement disguised as a question, or an attack disguised as a question. Mr. Horn, what gives you the right to tell women what they can and can't do with their bodies? I mean, I don't like abortion, but I don't go around shoving my beliefs down people's throats like you do. All right, for a lot of us, them's fighting words. You want to talk about pushing? I'm not pushing beliefs. You know who's pushing beliefs? The abortionist pushing his lethal beliefs on this baby that he dismembers. What do you think about that, huh? We want to turn the knob up. And other people just want to turn it all the way down. Like, well, that's what you believe. That's what, I'm not trying to push anything. I'm just, I think we should be able to talk about this. We think we can only turn the knob up or only turn the knob down. But you don't need to have all the right answers. You have to have the right questions. I need to show Kylie, before I make a defense of being pro-life, I need to show Kylie there's something wrong with what you believe. Now, I could just say, there's something wrong with what you believe. But when you just tell people that, you give it tacit permission to let it go in one ear and out the other. People feel preached at, talked down to. But when you ask someone a question, as the Christian apologist Greg Koukl says, it takes you out of the hot seat and it puts you in the driver's seat of the conversation. Now you're in control, and you can stand up for the faith and make someone really consider this, because when you ask them a question, it's going to stick with them. So I asked Kylie a very simple, and I try to always ask what I call dumb questions. Dumb questions are ones that seem like, why would you even bother asking that? But it reveals a core assumption that has to be challenged. Mr. Horn, what gives you the right to push your beliefs on other people? I mean, I don't like abortion, but I don't go around shoving my beliefs down people's throats like you do. Now, what question would you ask Kylie? Anyone? Shout it out if you have an idea.
66 million have already been killed.
66 million have been killed? But notice that's not a question, though. What's a really simple question to ask her to get her to think? What about women killed in the womb? I'll give you a hint. It starts with why. We got one over here. I asked her, Kylie, why don't you like abortion? Now, you see why that sounds like a dumb question? Like, well, come on. On both sides, we disagree, but it seems like we agree that why people wouldn't like this, But why don't you like it? I asked her, why don't you like it? She said, well, isn't it obvious? Okay, pretend I'm like 5 years old. Just humor me, how would you explain it to me? Well, it takes a life out of the world. I said, well, help me out here. What do you mean by that? What do you mean it takes a life out of the world? I mean, if I step on a snail, I take a life out of the world. Is that an abortion? Well, no. Okay, well, what's the difference? Notice here, I don't even have to know anything about pro-life apologetics or abortion. I'm just asking questions. She said, well, it takes a human life out of the world. It takes a baby. But I mean, I can't tell women what they can and can't do. Now, the temptation is to want to turn the volume up and say, so you're okay with killing babies? We want to drive it home. But I believe there's a different approach we have to take when we ask questions like this. So I said to her, look, Kylie, I don't quite understand where you're coming from. Can you help me see what you're saying? You don't like abortion because it takes a baby out of the world, it kills a baby. But you can't tell women that they can't do that to their babies. I don't understand that. Can you help me see what I'm not getting? And then all the other students turn around, they look at Kylie, and she's starting to turn red. And she says, well, it sounds bad when you put it that way. I said, well, Kylie, I didn't put it that way, you did. So this approach, also called the Socratic approach, based on the work of this guy named Socrates, you might have heard of him, lived in Athens 2,500 years ago, came up with a message, Socrates, everybody, method of asking questions to come at the truth, that even if you don't know a lot about our Catholic faith, or you feel like you don't have all those Bible verses off the top of your head, you can ask people questions to expose that if they have a non-Catholic worldview, whether it's Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, non-religious, whatever it may be, or it's a Catholic dissenting worldview that is not faithful to the teachings of the church, there's a flaw, there's a falsehood, there's an incoherency somewhere in there. And by asking questions, we can expose it. And at the very least, we can make that person uncomfortable with what they believe, and they grapple with it doesn't make sense, and then present our truth at a time and place that is appropriate to them. So it comes from Socrates. Another person, of course, who put this method to great use is our Lord, Jesus himself. Mark chapter 11 is a great example of this. The Pharisees go to Jesus. Jesus has been healing people on the Sabbath. He's been teaching, and the Pharisees say to him, who gave you the authority to do these things? Now, Jesus could have gave a long theological answer or a short theological answer. My dad, the guy who made everything. Could have done that. But instead, he asked a question, that through a question, he could expose the Pharisees' hypocrisy. He said, well, this is the dynamic Trent Horn paraphrase of Mark 11. Tell you what, I'll answer your question if you're willing to answer one of my questions. The baptism of John, is it from heaven or from earth? Answer me, then I'll answer you. Is it of heavenly origin or earthly origin? John the Baptist. Then Mark tells us the Pharisees got in a huddle, and they realized they were in trouble. Now, they didn't come out and condemn John the Baptist, but they also didn't come out and support him either. So they said, well, if we say John the Baptist, his baptism is from heaven, the people will say, why didn't you believe him? Why didn't you support him? If we say it is from earth, it's from men, the people will revolt, because the people believe and recognize that John is a legitimate prophet, even if the religious leaders do not. So religious leaders not living up to what they should be doing has been a perennial problem for God's people, okay? But God's people have always found a way. So the Pharisees go back to Jesus, and they do what happens to me a lot when people realize they're in a dilemma they can't get out of. We don't know. Jesus says, well, then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Mark says the people were amazed by his teaching and his authority, because Jesus, through a simple question, could show the Pharisees didn't really care about authority because they never bothered to settle the question about John. He exposed their hypocrisy without saying outright they were hypocrites. Now, in other cases, sometimes it's okay just to call somebody out. That's perfectly acceptable. In Matthew 23, Jesus does that to the religious leaders. But in many other cases, when we're talking to people, it's helpful to use this question-based approach. Another example to help you see, especially if you notice with Kylie, the attitude I took was kind of like I don't quite understand all of this, even though I really do. And maybe you can explain this to me. If you're a fan of older television shows, you've seen this tactic before. It was modeled to great effect on Columbo. Anyone ever watch Columbo? I was once snowed in Wichita, Kansas for a week at a friend's house. No internet, no cable, and all he had in the DVD cabinet was the entire series of Columbo. The original run of Columbo. The whole thing. So I sat there with my Target microwave dinners, and I just watched Columbo. And now it is certainly delightful. It all kind of goes very similar. Columbo goes in, there's the dead body, there's the suspect, who for some reason is not halfway to Mexico, but is there, almost taunting Columbo, thinking they've gotten away with the perfect crime. Columbo realizes, wait, not everything adds up, but when he goes and investigates, he looks like this, my Jewish grandfather would say, a schlub, basically. He's got his hat, his trench coat, and it doesn't quite always seem right there. He's getting ashes everywhere on the ground. And he says, oh, I'm terribly sorry about that. I just got a few questions. I'll be out of here in a second. Terrible what happened to your uncle here. Has a heart attack on his exercise bike. Yeah, we're having a terrible time for all of us. You cops snooping around. That's fine. I just have a few questions and I'll be on my way. I don't mean to be a bother or anything. And so he writes it down and then he leaves and he says, I just have one more question if you don't mind. You said you hear your uncle taking a shower, and you come out and you see him, he's dead on his exercise bike. Yeah, that's right. Well, can you answer the question, who takes a shower before they exercise? Do you do that? Because I don't do that. Does that make sense to you? And Columbo starts asking these questions to reveal the flaws in the other person's alibi, the holes in their story. Now, Columbo doesn't come on too strong, because he makes it seem like that the suspect can won over him. But by being calm and having this attitude of, can you help me see what I'm not getting, the suspect is willing to talk more and more and kind of hang himself by his own words. Now, I am not advocating that you should use this method to entrap, to ensnare, or to make people feel small or stupid. And this method can be abused to do that. You should not do that with people. But it should be done with a genuine sense of wanting to go to yearn for the truth. And a lot of times we think that in order to defend our faith, we have to stand toe-to-toe with somebody, like we're in a boxing match with them, and we want to get a good few hits in with our arguments. But that's not the attitude we should have. We should not be standing toe-to-toe with a fight. Instead, it's shoulder to shoulder, and we're walking together, and we're giving them these ideas, and we're asking them these kinds of questions to get them to rethink these issues. And you can do this with all kinds of subjects that come up, that you should try to boil down the issue to one central question. So with abortion, I like the question, what are the unborn? And so I ask really simple questions. Well, what do you think about abortion? It's coming up now with late-term abortion. Where do you draw the line? Why do you draw the line here and not there? If you don't know what to say in a conversation, you can always ask, what do you think, and why do you think that? Or, if you don't want to seem too antagonistic, what do you think, and how did you come to believe that? Or, how do you know that's true? I was once a volunteer in a confirmation program. Has anyone here ever volunteered in a high school confirmation program or high school youth group ministry? My friend, Mike Phelan, has a wonderful description of the teens you can have in these kinds of programs with an analogy from Lord of the Rings. There's 3 types. There are the elves, who are the super duper helpful teens that will stack the chairs and be the last to get pizza. There are the hobbits, who are kind of the troublemakers but have good hearts. And then there are the orcs. They're the ones who have been basically imprisoned there by their parents and will do anything to derail the program that you're at. So I remember there was this small group, and there was this orc, there was this teen who really, really didn't want to be there. And he was verbally tearing down other people's faiths. My youth minister said to me, Trent, this guy's so bad he made one of the girls in the group cry. So I went and I sat down in the group, and they asked the standard question you ask. On a scale from 1 to 10, how do you rate your relationship with Jesus? And when you have teens, you get the same answer. It's a 7 or an 8. It's an 8. I got a B. I'm not bragging, but I'm also doing well enough to keep my GPA up, okay? So leave me alone. You don't want to say a 10 because then people will be like, are you going to walk on water, Mother Teresa? You don't want to say like a 1 because then you're attracting more attention to yourself. So then it goes all the way around to this young teen. I'll call him Daniel. And Daniel said, 0. There was no Jesus. He was a myth that was made up. And there's that one girl who's about to cry again. And I said, well, Daniel, how do you know that's true? Well, it's all just in the Bible, right? Well, yeah, but there's other things outside the Bible, but how do you know that's true that Jesus was made up? You don't trust the Bible? No, I don't. Okay, but even if you don't, how do you know it's not true? How do you know it's made up? How did you come to believe this? He said, well, I saw it in this documentary on YouTube. I said, well, how do you know that documentary's right? How do you know they didn't make things up? Well, I don't know. I mean, it sounded right. I'm like, well, how do you know it sounded right, though? It sounds like you've already arrived at the answer before you've even seen it. And then, so the negative case, here's why you should doubt what you believe. Then the positive case, I said, Daniel, what do you think about ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus, who wrote about Jesus less than 100 years after his death? I mean, if Jesus is made up, why did they write about someone who never existed? And he just sat there, and then it's like the first person who blinks loses. And then this tumbleweed goes by right between us in the middle of this gym. And then he says, well, fine, it's a 2. That's progress. I don't know if anyone's good at math, but 0 to 2, I think, is an increase by an infinite percentage from 0 to 2. So that's progress. That's progress when we're talking with people. And I talked to Daniel Moore, and even some of his other friends are on the retreat, talking to them things about atheism. I get calls, why are you an atheist? Now, this is one we can have a lot of problems. An atheist will say, why don't you prove that God exists? And then we think, oh, I've heard this on Catholic Answers Live, I read this book, but suddenly all these philosophical proofs, like they all get jumbled in your mind, and well, what do I say? Remember, you don't need to have all the right answers. You just need to have the right questions. So when I talk to atheists on air, I could give them a valid 20-premise syllogism and walk them through, but it's not going to be effective. It's going to be in one ear, out the other. So with atheists, I like to ask these 2 questions. First, what is the best argument you've ever heard for the existence of God? And what's wrong with it? Because I ask them, well, look, why don't you believe in God? Usually, number 1 answer, not enough evidence. No one's proven God exists. Okay, well, you would know there's no good evidence. You could only say there's no evidence for God for 2 reasons. 1, you looked at the reasons, found them lacking, or you didn't bother to look at the reasons at all, which would be intellectually lazy, right? So what's the best reason you've heard and what's wrong with it? Now notice when you do this, you're in the driver's seat. You don't have to know a ton of philosophy. Now the burden is on this other person to defend what they believe. They've got to put forward the argument and say what's wrong with it. And you can then ask them, well, why don't you find that convincing? And many times, they won't be able to produce even an argument. It's just an assertion or an opinion that they have. But they're the one who is in the hot seat that has to defend their view. You aren't. Another great question to ask an atheist, what would change your mind? What specific incident would change your mind to get you to believe in God? A lot of them say a miracle. I was debating a guy named Dan Barker a few months ago, and Dan is an interesting fellow. Dan used to be a Protestant preacher for like 20, 30 years, and he became a atheistic evangelist. You know, knock, knock, here's the good news. After you die, nothing happens. But that's what he does. He's an evangelist for atheism. And he said he had an envelope with a number inside of it. And he said if I could tell him that number on stage, he would believe in God. And I said, well, that sounds like if I could do a magic trick that you would believe. I know a guy named Patrick Coffin who could probably convert you in about 5 minutes if any of you follow the Patrick Coffin show. You know, that's what a magician could do. Another answer I hear is this: if I could pray and restore an amputated limb, if they could see that, they would believe. I was in a debate once and the guy said, I believe if a limb appeared after somebody prayed. And I said, why? Why would you believe that God is behind that? And he said, well, because, you know, limbs don't come from nothing. I said, well, let me try something else with you. If I could pray, instead of an arm, a Corvette appeared, and it's yours. Here you go. You're welcome. Would you believe? Sure. How about if I prayed and a second moon appeared around the earth? Yeah. So as the object gets bigger and bigger, that comes from nothing. You would believe in God. So in the debate, I asked my opponent, what if a whole universe came from nothing? Would you believe in God? No. Because we have evidence of a universe from nothing. Now, I could have started with that, but by asking the question, I reveal an intellectual double standard with this individual. And so what we have to do in these situations is to be able to maintain our peace. People ask me all the time, how do you stay so calm on Catholic Answers Live when people are yelling at you or they're getting angry? How do you stay calm and ask questions? Well, I do something that Catholics are well accustomed to doing for a long time that brings a lot of peace and tranquility into my life. I drink. No, I don't do that. I don't do that. At least not on air, but responsibly. No, I pray and understanding that it's God's grace that is working through me. I pray and understand it's His grace working through me. I pray for this other person. I pray for the words for God to give me. I have patience with this person to understand they're not an enemy. There's someone who has been deceived. There's someone who has emotional baggage that they are carrying with them that I have to be cognizant of and know that I'm walking shoulder to shoulder with them, and my goal in the conversation is not to convert them. That is the job of the Holy Spirit. I cannot convert anyone. You cannot convert anyone. But the Holy Spirit can. But He chooses to use us as instruments of God's grace so that when we have these conversations, when we ask these questions of people, we put a little pebble in their shoe, an idea, a thought, a question that they're really grappling with, that days, weeks, months, and years later is rolling around in their shoe, a pebble in their shoe, a thought in their mind. You know, that Catholic friend, that Catholic guy I was talking to, he was really on to something and gets them to think about that. And one last note, though, is especially tailored for being here at this particular event, to know that when we go out and do this, when we go and stand up for our faith in public, know that even if we do so with the best of intentions, with the best attitude, that it's a fight. There's a reason it's called a culture war. And to understand that Jesus said if people hated you, remember they hated me from the beginning. And to not respond with anger, St. Paul says in his letter to the Romans that you should kill your enemy with kindness, that if an enemy attacks you, that doing kindness to your opponent is like heaping hot coals upon their heads. There's some boys here from Covington Catholic, actually. And so I'm very glad that they're here. And I had mentioned on air after that incident, you know, during the March for Life, that, that I'm very proud of how they handled themselves. And to know, I think this will remind people that a lot of times we get lulled into a false sense of security, that we can just have our faith as a normal part of life. Our faith is not normal to many people. We are seen as I remember once I was reading an interview with Dr. Warren Hearn. He is an abortionist who does first, second, and third trimester abortions. He once said the only difference between pro-lifers and the Taliban, the extremist terrorist group in Afghanistan that throws acid on women's faces, he said the only difference between pro-lifers and them is 8,000 miles. That's how people will view us. And so they will misrepresent us. They will lie about us. They will attack us. We have to be prepared for that and stand up for one another and not throw each other under the bus to appease a secular world. The person we should please is our Lord and Savior by imitating him, in that when people malign us and attack us, we stand firm and speak the truth in love, as St. Paul said in Ephesians 4:15, and support one another in doing so by following this method to be warriors of peace in a world shrouded in darkness that desperately needs, the light of the gospel. I very much hope you all will be those lights going out after today. So thank you all very much for being here.